Welcome to this second lecture of Module 2, where I am going to talk about why we see variation in state strength, and then also what in comparative politics we consider to be a way to measure state strength. So these are the two sets of concepts that I'll be talking about today. All right, so in the previous lecture, I had talked about the fact that modern states have 4 characteristics, and they use these characteristics to provide political goods, which are defined as essentially the things that we expect the modern state to give us, right? So we expect the modern state to provide for security. As citizens of a state, we expect that the state will defend us from both internal and external threats. We expect that the state will provide a rule of law, a legal system, roads, schools. Some modern states provide public health care for their citizens, others do not. It might be economic policies, right? So, but these are political goods that we expect the modern state to provide. And states do differ in their ability to provide these political goods. So strong states, generally capable of providing adequate goods to all citizens. Weak states, only partially do so. And failed states are essentially so weak that they lose their ability to provide internal sovereignty, right? So these are states that are undergoing or in the midst of a civil war. Now, this is a different way to think about state strength than what you maybe have been used to, or what you would associate with state strength. So in international relations, for example, we might think about state strength based on military power. And this is, in fact, a way that we measure state strength in international relations. So we would look at maybe, for example, how much states spend on defense. The US spends quite a lot on defense, right? We also might look at how large a state's military is, for example, right? Or alternatively, how much of its gross domestic product goes towards defense spending, not just in absolute terms, but as a percentage of its GDP. And here, the US would be considered an extremely strong state, right, in terms of its military power. But that is because in international relations, we're talking about relations between countries. So one way to figure out who is the top dog in the world is to determine who has the biggest military. But because in comparative politics, we're focused on the politics within countries, right? What that means is we are looking at more than just military power. Okay. This would be a map demonstrating the strength of states around the world when we have a more comprehensive view of it, right? When we're not just focused on military power. And you can see here, countries that are in this blue shade are considered to be the strongest states, right? Again, not militarily, but based on a host of other factors related to the characteristics that modern states have. And the US is considered in the green, right? So it's stable, but it's not the strongest state in the world according to the Fragile States Index. All right, so what explains state strength? Well, we have a whole host of theories that correspond to the interests, beliefs, and structures that we learned about last week. So one explanation is essentially when states went through the process of having to defend themselves from external threats, that's what made them stronger. So there's a whole host of information on this slide, but what I want you to get from it is essentially this idea that war made the state and the state made war. Because there were so many conflicts between entities, right? That when states started to emerge, which was described in your textbook reading, they had to defend themselves. So they had to claim territory, they had to create a bureaucracy, they had to create a military, they had to collect taxes in order to fund that military. And that process of external competition is what incentivized leaders and just elites in society to decide to give up their ability to defend themselves, give it to the state. In return, the state would defend them from external threats. So that's one explanation. Another has to do with, were you controlled by a European state or not? So if you were a colony of a European state, your resources were depleted, were used to fund actually the expansion of that European power. And so when countries became independent that used to be former colonies, they inherited really what were weak states because a lot of the resources had been depleted, a lot of people had been killed, whether through violence or through disease. Now, there is an interesting twist on this argument about colonial rule. Some political scientists and even economists have argued that the way in which you were ruled as a colony may have impacted your ability to develop economically and therefore become a stronger state. So if you had a colonial power who settled its population on your territory, right? They established different institutions because those Europeans lived on that land. And so when they left, you were able to kind of take the institutions that they had created, maybe like a civil service, some kind of court system. Obviously, that was not fair to anybody but Europeans when they were controlled by their former colony or by their colonial power. But states like that were able to take that kind of existing infrastructure and build on it as they became independent, versus if you had a colonial power who was really extractive, just kind of took all of the resources, didn't settle anybody on that land. You, when you became independent as a state, were really at a severe disadvantage because you had to build everything from scratch. So that's another variation of this argument that whether you were a former colony or not influenced your ability to become a strong state. Another explanation has to do with the resource curse. So when we think about the resource curse, it's essentially, we would expect that if a country has natural resources, oil, natural gas, diamonds, etc., that they should be able to use any money from that to reinvest back into the economy, reinvest back into making themselves a stronger state, providing for people, right? But what a lot of research has shown is that if you discover natural resources when you're not a democracy, so when you don't have any checks and balances, your leaders tend to take any types of profits from those natural resources and just basically invest it back into themselves and their small cohort of insiders. And so you end up getting a very weak state. And so an example would be, there are several countries in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa that are extremely rich in natural resources, but they were not democracies when they discovered them. And so many of them are considered to be very weak states. And also they've experienced conflicts over those resources where there have been civil wars that have been fought. Now we can compare that to, say, Norway. Norway is also rich in natural resources. It has oil, but Norway was a democracy when that was discovered. And so those checks and balances enabled Norway to use those resources to invest back into the state and become a stronger state. All right, another argument has to do with norms against territorial conquest. So this, the idea of elite coalitions, that's kind of a mix of the rational choice and institutional argument. The idea of, do you have natural resources? That really is a structural argument, right? That's a characteristics of the state. Norms against territorial conquest, this would fall into the beliefs category. So, what this essentially argues, this explanation, is that after the end of World War II, there was a norm, there was basically a belief about how countries were supposed to act on the international stage, where you're not supposed to invade your neighbor. There was a lot of invasions of neighbors that happened before the end of World War II and obviously during World War II. But with the creation of the United Nations, that charter specifically prohibited member states from resolving their disputes through force, right? You're supposed to resolve them through diplomacy, through the United Nations. You're definitely not supposed to invade your neighbor if your country is poor, or if you're having like an economic downturn and you want your neighbor's natural resources. And so the idea here is that after the emergence of that norm, countries that would have become swallowed up by their neighbors because they were weak continued to exist. And so, therefore, we see more weak states in the world after World War II because this norm prevents, ideally, it prevents neighbors from invading each other. Now, obviously, that norm is not abided by 100% of the time. Russia invaded Ukraine both in 2014 by annexing Crimea and then more recently in 2022. But this is another explanation for why we see some states being weak and others strong. And then finally, another explanation has to do with foreign aid. Now, there's been like a really big debate among scholars who study foreign aid. Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? Right? Foreign aid, essentially, when you don't have any expectations for checks and balances, or when you don't have any kind of conditions added onto it that would encourage states or like leaders of states to invest back into that state to make it stronger, that can be akin to a natural resource curse, where you may have leaders using that foreign aid to essentially enrich themselves and their smaller cohort of fellow elites who support them. So again, having checks and balances can be helpful when you get foreign aid. All right, and that, in case you're wondering, I provided some additional slides about U.S. foreign aid. Since we are talking about foreign aid, right, this is essentially aid that's distributed by states to other states, and oftentimes Americans think that foreign aid makes up a large chunk of the U.S. federal budget, but it does not, right? It like hovers around 1.5% of the U.S. foreign budget. And then if you're curious, this is what U.S. foreign aid goes for and who gets it. And that is going to be it for this lecture about state strength.